Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'll be showing you how to rebuild a KTM and Husky linkage style rear shock. There's a couple different reasons you'll be in this rear shock and rebuilding it. You could be just changing out the old oil and getting some fresh stuff in it, or like us, we actually have a leaky shock seal. So we need to take care of that, but doing that on these WP shocks can be a little difficult because this reservoir has a floating piston in it and you need a special vacuum pump to bleed all the air out. Now, Racetech came up with this bladder cap kit, and it actually replaces the reservoir and makes it easy to bleed. So we'll show you how to install that and replace this seal, and we'll get that done. But keep in mind, this procedure will be similar for 2016 to current model KTM and Husky bikes with the linkage style rear shock. Now we're working on a 2019 KTM 450 XCF, but always refer to your model specific service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. To do this job, you'll need some basic hand tools, rags, and safety glasses. We'll also be using an oil pan, heat gun, and strap wrench. We have some specialty suspension tools, and for parts, we're using an all balls seal head that makes the job easier because we don't have to replace seals individually. We have our Racetech bladder cap kit, some suspension clean, and suspension fluid. If you need any of these specialty suspension tools or parts, they're available on our website. Our first step is to record the current settings we have on the shock so we can put everything back how it was. The first thing we're going to do is measure from the top of the spring to the bottom, and we'll record that measurement. With that recorded, now we can turn our clickers in. We'll start with the rebound clicker and count the number of clicks it takes to lightly bottom out. That way we can return it to that position. So we have 10 clicks. We'll write that down and then back the adjuster all the way out counterclockwise. After that, we'll do the same thing with the compression adjuster. After that, we'll do the same thing with the high-speed compression adjuster, but instead of having clicks, we'll be counting the number of turns. So we'll go all the way clockwise in and then back it out all the way counterclockwise. Next, we'll put our shock into the vise and make sure you're using soft jaws. Now we'll loosen this screw on our adjuster ring and we'll back it out. Until there's no more tension on the spring. Now we'll take the spring stopper and move it up. Then you have this lock ring on the bottom and we'll just pop that off. Take off the spring stopper. And there's a washer on the bottom of the spring too. So keep all this stuff in order when you're taking it off. And sometimes these springs are directional. Only one side has a smaller diameter than the other, so I just keep everything in the same orientation that it came off. Now there's one more washer on top, so we'll move that off along with it. Now we can take out the screw in our reservoir. When you do this, you need to be really careful, wear safety glasses, and we'll remove this screw really slow and just let a little bit of nitrogen out at a time. You can hear it leaking out right there. We'll let all of that nitrogen leak out for now before we finish removing the screw. We obviously won't be reusing this O-ring, but we'll keep track of it anyway, just in case we ever decide to use this style again. Now, we want to keep this as clean as possible while we're taking everything apart. We did try to wash the shock off as best as we could with it on the bike, but there's still a little bit of sand here and there. So we'll wipe that off and we'll remove this cap, and then we'll kind of clean around the shock seal. To remove the cap, we'll just use a punch and knock up on these holes. This one came out pretty easy. To keep this cap out of the way, I like to just take a small zip tie and we'll tighten it down around this shaft. With the cap out of the way, we actually do have a little bit of sand down in here, and we do want to get that cleaned up because it's important to keep all of these parts as clean as possible. We don't want any sand particles getting down in this body and somehow getting overlooked and staying in there. Now we'll take our Race Tech seal head setting tool and we'll press our seal head down. We'll press the seal head just low enough so we can get good access to this retaining clip for the shock seal. Now we'll remove our retaining clip. We're using some special retaining clip pliers. You could also use a small screwdriver or even a pick. This tool just makes the job a little bit easier. We'll clean the shock body one more time, and while we do this, we'll check for any damage to the shock body or any burrs that that clip may have caused. Next, get your oil pan ready, and we'll remove the shock shaft. Now, be careful when you do this. It could get really messy really quick, so just use a little bit of patience and try not to get oil all over your shoes. So at this point, we've got it up a little bit. Now we'll just work it out nice and slow. We'll let some of that oil drip down into our drip pan. And we'll lay the shock shaft out on the table. Now we can remove the shock body from the vise, and we'll dump all of this oil into our oil pan. I'll also spray off any oil so our strap wrench gets a good bite. To remove this reservoir, we'll use a heat gun to loosen up any Loctite on these threads down here, and then we'll use a strap wrench to loosen it up. Now this strap wrench, we made it easy, and we actually have these available on our website. For us, we did have to get this pretty warm to take this off. So make sure you do that. And then we also probably should have taken off the sticker first. It gets a little messy. So if you have a sticker on yours, it might be a good idea to take that off before you use the strap wrench on it. Now we'll remove our shock body from the vise, and we'll take our shock shaft, put it in, and take everything apart, get it ready for cleaning and inspection. Now we can take the nut off of our shock shaft, and we'll do that with a 19mm socket. Now this next part is really important. We'll use a screwdriver to keep the shim stacks and piston and all these pieces in order so we don't mess them up. Then we can remove our seal, take off our zip tie, take the cap off, lay these out in order, and the last thing is the rubber bumper. Now we're ready to clean and inspect all of our parts. So we'll go ahead and start with the shock shaft. We'll wipe it down and spray it off. Check for any dings or nicks in the shaft. Make sure it's not bent. You've got a couple little holes right here. We'll clean these passageways out. We'll wipe down our bumper, but we won't be spraying it off. We don't want to get any harsh chemicals on it. Clean our cap off, spray our shim stacks off, and we'll check our piston ring and make sure it's in good condition. If the piston ring is worn out, you're going to have some wear marks on the side or scratches, or it could have a bronze color to it. Now we'll get our shock body cleaned up. We've got a ton of sand on this one, so we'll definitely want to take our time and make sure all of our passages are clean. After we've sprayed the shock body down, we'll visually inspect it for any damage. The next thing we'll do, we'll take our shock shaft, put it back in the vise, and we'll get it prepped for assembly. Slide our bumper on, our cap. We will be reusing this top out spring, so we'll remove it from the old seal head and clean it up. Before we put this spring on our new seal head, we'll put some grease on the dust and oil seal on the seal head, as well as this O-ring right here. Now we can take our top out spring and put it onto our new seal head. So that's ready to be installed. Now we'll take the Tusk seal bullet and slide it onto our shaft. That keeps the shaft from tearing up our new seal. To help us do this, We'll pour a little shock oil into the cap, and we'll coat our seal bullet and the shaft with a little bit of oil. That'll make sure everything slides on nice and easy. And we'll slowly work this seal on. And voila. Next, we'll take our clean shim stacks and piston, and we'll slide these back onto our shaft. You might have to be a little patient and slide these shims on one at a time if they're a little misaligned. We'll work them on just like that. Make sure everything's seated correctly. And then we can take our nut, and this actually is a lock nut, but just to be safe, we'll put a little bit of thread locker on there, make sure it's not going anywhere. One thing that's important, some of this thread lock, if it gets pushed on top of the nut, it could come around this rebound hole, and we don't want any of it going in there, so we'll wipe off any extra thread lock. Next, we'll torque this nut to 29.5 foot-pounds. Now we'll remove the shock shaft, and we'll place it on some clean rags so we don't get it dirty, and then we'll take our shock body, put it back into the vise. To install our new reservoir, we'll need to make sure these threads are completely clean and free of oil. Then we'll apply some Loctite to our reservoir threads and a little bit of grease to this O-ring just down in here, and we'll tighten it down using a strap wrench. Now keep in mind, the thread lock we're using here came with our Racetech Bladder kit. We had a little bit of the thread Loctite come up, and we'll just wipe off all the extra with a rag and use a little bit of contact cleaner if we need to. To put this thing back together, we'll put some of our suspension fluid in here. We'll start in this main body and let it work through our compression valving and into the reservoir. That'll help any air get out of there. And then we can even try tapping the top a little bit to help it bleed out. We've got the suspension flowing through our compression valve into the reservoir. So now we'll fill it up to maybe a little more than halfway. And what we'll do, we'll take our bladder, put a little bit of oil on it and a little bit of grease on the seal right here, and we will press it down in here. To do that, we'll remove our cap and the schrader valve. As we put the bladder in the reservoir, we want to make sure that the reservoir overflows with oil, just like that. And when we get to this point, this is where it seals off. When we push this more in, it's actually going to collapse our bladder just a little bit. And we do want that to happen, and I'll explain that in a minute. But we'll press this down just enough. There's a retaining clip groove at the top of this reservoir, so we'll push it down just far enough to get that clip in. Make sure that the ring is completely seated in this landing here. If it's not, it could be really dangerous, so double check that for sure. Now you can either use an air pump or something like that to pull this bladder up. We're actually using the Racetech bladder removal tool, and we'll pull this cap up to seat against that ring we just installed. Next, we'll take some more suspension fluid and fill the shock body pretty close to the top, maybe a ½ inch from the top. Now we'll put the shock shaft into the shock body. Keep in mind that a little bit of oil is going to come out when we put this in, so just take it slow and be careful. And what we're trying to do here, we'll be bleeding any air bubbles out. So now that we've got that in, we'll pump our shock shaft up and down a little bit. And we'll do that until we don't see any more air bubbles coming out. And we'll always make sure that the oil level is close to the top of the shock. And sometimes it helps to press quickly down as you press the shaft into the body, and it helps some of the bubbles come up. Keep in mind that just below the shim stack on these, you have some rebound adjusting holes that oil passes through, and you always want to keep those submerged under oil at all times, otherwise you'll get a little bit of air in the system, and we don't want that. Okay, now we'll top the shock body off with a little bit of oil. We'll move this seal head down to where it seats. And when this goes in, there's going to be too much oil, and it's actually going to compress this bladder. So we do have our schrader valve pulled out, and we'll go ahead and press this in, and we'll press the seal head in just past that stopper ring groove. Next, we'll install the stopper ring back into the shock body. Make sure it sits squarely in the groove. Now we'll pull up on the shaft and extend it all the way. We'll clean all the oil that spilled out. And we'll use our side cutters and cut this zip tie that was holding our cap out of the way. And now we can tap this cap into place. Now keep in mind, the cap has a couple holes in it, and we'll align these holes with the shock eyelet the same way it would go on the bike, and that way the low spot, if any kind of moisture or water gets in here, it helps it drain out a little bit easier. Now we'll remove the shock from the vise and flip it over. Next, we'll crack our bleeder bolt loose. With our bleeder bolt cracked loose, we'll position the shock in the vise so that this bleeder hole is at the highest position. And when we open this up, all the extra oil we forced into here is going to come out along with any air bubbles. And when you're tightening this down, be really careful with the shock body, and you'll just barely need to snug it down, and be sure to not over tighten it. So that's going to let all our extra oil out as well as the air. Now make sure that O-ring stays in place, and we'll tighten this bolt back down. Two things I want to point out. Our shaft is extended all the way, and the schrader valve is out of the bladder. If your schrader valve's in the bladder, it won't allow the bladder to expand back out and push the air and oil out. Again, KTM, Husky, and WP will tell you to use their vacuum bleeding tools shown in the service manual, and that is the best way to guarantee that you get all the air out of the shock. So if you have access to one of those pumps at your local shop, we recommend that you use that method of bleeding. If that's not an option for you, then the method that we just showed you is the next best way to bleed your shock and get all the air out of the system. Now we can take our schrader valve and install it back into our bladder. Now we can put our valve cap on, and we'll use our suspension clean again, get all this oil off of it. Now you can fill this with nitrogen either now or after the spring's on. I like to do it now, and that way we can make the shock extends all the way and that the valving's all working correctly, and that we don't have any air in there. So we'll go ahead and remove this from the vise. We'll get our oil pan. We'll spray all this oil off. Now, we realize a lot of you guys won't have nitrogen tanks, so if you don't, you can usually take it to a local shop and they'll fill it up for a small charge. Now that we have our shock filled up with nitrogen, we'll compress the shaft. And make sure it extends all the way on its own and smoothly. Now ours looks pretty good, so we'll go ahead and reinstall this back into the vise. Now we'll take our washer that was on top, put that down onto the adjuster right there, and then we'll take our spring, install it the same orientation we took it off in. We've got another washer that's going on bottom. We'll wipe that off, make sure it's clean. And then we'll take our spring retainer, we'll set that in place, and then we can take our retaining clip, We'll slide this down into place, make sure it seats fully into its groove, and then we can adjust our shock preload back up. And this is why we took the measurement earlier, just so we can quickly put it back into the right spot, and we should have the same sag we did before. After you have the spring length set, you'll want to tighten down your adjuster lock ring. And we can now set our compression and rebound settings back to their original positions. And that's all there is to installing your Racetech bladder cap kit and shock seal on these KTM Husky linkage style shocks. The parts we use today, as well as some of the special tools, are available on our website, along with just about anything you could want for your bike. So be sure to check that out, and if you like this video and want to see more like it, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.